All right. We good? Boss back there? Hello. Good evening. Good evening. Hello. 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 I don't think the speakers are on. They keep turning off. Oh no. Chad said there was something on Sunday that was being wonky with them. Oh, great. Wonderful. I mean, I guess that's the only thing that matters. They can hear my voice, so. He said something about, I can't remember what he said. Something on Sunday about Chad. He said there might be like an issue with a piece of equipment. Oh, but it's gonna go off. I think in like 2 minutes because it did that on Sunday, and then he had to he rerouted something. Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm good. If the speaker goes out, it's okay. It has some sort of relay switch is being wonky. But good evening. Great to see you all. Welcome to part two of The Way Out, the Gospel of Exodus. Seen a lot of newish faces from last week. Last week we kind of dug into that the book of Exodus is largely a book about relationships. Literally, the title of the book is These Are the Names, which is interesting in Hebrew because it's all about these people. It's all about this group of people. We talked a lot about the book being deeply connected to creation theology, which is just a fancy way of saying that most of what's happening in Exodus is big references back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So there's a lot of pull from that creational picture. So it was a lot of fun. We talked through one of the biggest pictures that we see is that God is being revealed as the creator of the universe, in whom everything is like consisting and held together in him. He reveals himself to Moses as Yahweh, which is a big deal, versus the decreator in the story, which is Pharaoh. Pharaoh functions as a foil to Yahweh, and it's a cosmic battle. Um, Pharaoh represents basically the embodiment of the Egyptian deities whose primary like ideology is driven by power. It's all about power, and it's also about death. There's a ton. The Egyptians were big advocates of the afterlife, and so death was a big deity to them. And so Pharaoh then basically takes this to the fullest extent. He begins to engage in power and murder. He kills babies. All of these things are removing and destroying life versus Yahweh, who's giving life. And the foil continues, the irony continues because it's like two women basically decide to not listen to the Pharaoh. They start saving all the little boys. Then a third woman is introduced who has a special little boy who doesn't kill him. She hides him. Then a sister who also then takes the little boy down the river to then a Pharaoh's daughter. So all these women basically are overthrowing the most powerful man in the universe, Pharaoh, at this time. And so it's a huge, amazing like picture that God does not go towards the top to bring change and to bring freedom and life. He actually moves downward. And so it's to the lowest, and women would have been considered not equal with men in the way that we have understood things now. The Hebrew culture like definitely begins to embody that, where they see male and female being a good thing. So there's a lot of interesting things concerning that that we talked a little bit about last week. We highlighted the calling of Moses and all the things that happen. Moses basically defines complaint and dialogue as the way to interact with God, which is very rare and uncommon. The deities in the ancient Near Eastern world are all so capricious that you're scared that they're going to just destroy you. And yet Moses felt the ability to complain and respond because he saw that God was alive in the bush but wasn't consuming the bush. So the revelation and the picture of that is that although God is fire, which is a life-giving entity, it does not consume. It does not destroy in the way that Pharaoh does as well. We talked a little bit just trying to give you guys a little overview because I'm going to refer back to some of these things. We talked about the gospel of Exodus in chapter 6, verses 2 through 8, where we basically saw that their whole goal is to come to know God for who he is, and so that they can become the people that they're supposed to be. And so in some ways, it really is a journey from slavery to salvation, the entirety of the book. And then we ended with just a little bit on the plagues. And we talked through all of the plagues are something kind of interesting, because in this theology of creation that I was mentioning, the ancient Near Eastern world, they believed that everything in creation was ordered in a certain way, and it was supposed to be that way, and the deities controlled that, and this is why you serve the deities, because they can mess up the universe and make it chaotic at any point. And so with this, particularly the Jewish people, believed that God was very righteous in his ordering of things. And so what you see in the plagues is that God says, okay, you want to live as if you're in control of everything, Pharaoh? I'm going to let you lead the whole universe in the natural way that it is, and I'm going to make it hypernatural. Like we've heard about supernatural, which would be very spiritual, but hypernatural would be to take the physical realities of creation and maximize them to their fullest expanse. So for instance, there's a gnat, but it's like there's so many gnats it's like dust. So it's like the hyper nature. And basically this is what God does. He gives them over to thinking, oh, Pharaoh, you think you can order the world? Have at it. And basically Pharaoh fails 10 times. And the last is probably the most painful and sad, is that there was great darkness, number 11, or number 9, and then 10, there is the death of all the firstborn in Egypt. And basically, this is a depiction that Pharaoh has so declared he is so powerful that the Lord's like, well, can you be powerful enough to overcome death? And the answer is no. He could not save his people in his own ability and his own power. And so in doing so, God reveals him to be a flawed sovereign over the universe, although he thought he was. And that brings us to chapter 12. Chapter 12 through 15 is what we're covering tonight. This is my subtitle, Passover to Praise, because that's basically what we're going to be covering, is a couple different pieces concerning Passover and praise. What I want to highlight to you as we begin these chapters is that in our world and in our culture, one of the things that I think we forget a lot about, and I mentioned this last week a little bit, is that everything in your life is formational. Everything that you do is forming you in one way, shape, fashion, or whatnot. And the joke is that God fashioned and formed you in your mother's womb beautifully. And the moment you were born, everything else has been trying to form you in the opposite way. And so Exodus is a formational book throughout Christian history. It has been used to describe and explain how Christian formation happens. The Jewish people also saw it as a formational book. They use this is what salvation looks like. And so what we get introduced in chapter 12 is something new to how formation happens. And I know that we're going to try not to trigger ourselves by this word, but it really is through ritual. So we get the introduction of a huge ritual in the Jewish world, which is called Passover. A ritual is basically a regularly occurring event that functions in the way of formation. Simple. So it's just a practice that we're engaging in that helps us bring formation. And so we're introduced to one of the most primitive formation pieces in Israel's history and in Christian history, which is Passover. Chapter 12 highlights what this looks like and how these practices of formation really do lead us to a place where we're acknowledging the goal of the formation, which is the promised land, the land filled with milk and honey, connection with God, deliverance from everything. It's really beautiful and wonderful. And so in the Passover, something very specific happens that I hope that we can process through. And so what I'd like us to do before we talk through it a little bit is I would love for you to discuss with your neighbor what is Passover? What do you know about it? What have you heard about it? What have you seen about it? And I'm just going to give you like 3 minutes to talk through what is Passover, and then we're going to lean in a little bit together. Okay? Ready, set, go. Passover. All right. Let's hear what you guys came up with. Some Passover. Raise your hand if you want to contribute something to Passover. Not everybody at once. Come. Angel of death passed over the doors of the people who covered the doorway with the blood of the Lamb. Okay? And in result, their children were saved. What else? Anything else you want to add? Oh, yes, of course. We're so Christian. Jesus is the Lamb. Okay, what else? What was each family? Yes. They did. Each family had to do this, and they did eat the lamb. Yes. They ate the lamb. They ate the whole lamb. Yes, they did. Yeah. Carl wants to be passed over. He wants to eat the lamb. All right. So the Hebrew word, I wrote it in English to help you. Pasak is the word, and it means two things: either to pass over, which is great, or to skip. So random. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. And so a couple things about Passover that are here but aren't here that I just want to highlight. So like I said, it is a ritual. And so number one, every household needs one lamb. So you don't need 6 lambs for 6 people in the house. It's 1 lamb for 1 household. You had to slaughter the lamb. You had to take the blood of the lamb and drain it out, and then use its blood to paint the lintel, which is the 2 sides of the door and the top of the door. And they smother it on, normally using hyssop branches. They roast the lamb. It's not to be stewed. This is very important. They have to eat a bitter salad as they're taking Passover. They also ate bread with no leaven. And then they also have to be dressed with shoes on, with a walking stick in their hand, and they had to eat fast. Okay, so those are like the big components that are in the passage. I know throughout history there's been some other things that have been added to it. At the end of it, the whole point of this Passover meal, this Passover experience, was that they would be people who would be prepared and ready to escape death by embracing life. Where's the life? In the blood. And so it's this picture that the life of creation has been given for these people to live, which goes back to Yahweh is the creator of all things. He basically said, if you don't want death to come to your door, you have to have life. And if you don't have life, the only other option is death. It's very black and white in some regards when it comes to this ancient Near Eastern mindset on life or death. So because of this, God gave them a pathway for them to be able to not experience death, but to experience the life that he had. Now, a lot of fascinating things about Passover. One, throughout the passage in chapter 12, you begin to see it constantly refers that Passover is something that is to be taught to children. You're like, what? Talk to children, this seems kind of like a little weird, bloody lambs, And the whole idea is that it's formation, that we're trying to form into these children's minds that there's a God who presides over life and death, and my response to his life is to follow life. If I don't follow life, then I will end up in death. And death is the pathway that the Egyptians have embraced. And so it's this countercultural movement that is being started for the next generation of children. And that they're going to continue to pass this along and along and along and along. Historically, the Passover has been one of the most identity-defining qualities or feasts or rituals that the Jewish people have basically embraced since the Exodus. It is deeply ingrained in the children as an identity piece that they are people to be obsessed and following life at all costs. At the same time, it's also beginning this new kind of expression that not only is God the creator, but he is also the redeemer, or he is the one who's willing to put into play everything. He'll put everything on the line so that life can be brought to the forefront. So the redemption of these people comes in the presentness of Passover, because in that moment they're having to be fully present to what's happening. And at the same time, there's a memory aspect to it, and there's a hope aspect to it. So as we lean into the present moment, that life and death is basically being offered to us, as we're present to that, we remember, as we remember the Passover, so that we will continue to choose life. And then as we choose life, we begin to have hope for the future. And so really the Passover is ultimately a story of both life and death, and it gives us this creation of a new community, because in the beginning, when God creates the heaven and the earth, it's formless and void, darkness hovers over the face of the earth, and God speaks, let there be life, let there be light, and there was light. We see the creation of all things, that God creates consistently from things that are dead. This is the way God's order works, is that if it's dead, then he brings life to it, because without him, it is dead. The universe is dead unless he's pouring his life into it. Humanity is empty without him being poured into it. And so in this Passover picture, it's a reminder, and it's a physical reminder, not just a mental reminder. They're physically acting these things out. And they have to be ready to move. They're wearing their shoes, they're wearing their clothes, they're ready to move, because right away they have to embrace the life that God's asking them, and it's initiating them into a new season altogether. It's interesting that as you read through chapter 12, you get this this interesting piece that I think a lot of times we forget and we miss, is that in this creation of a new community, it was not just the Hebrew people who were involved in it. It actually says, if there are any foreigners among you, which is at the end of chapter 12, if they would be circumcised, then they can also have Passover. And if they have Passover, then they also will not die. Why is this important? Well, because what we're seeing in Exodus is a greater expansion of what God's been promising to Abraham, which is that all the nations of the world will be granted this life forever. And so it's interesting because the marker, and I hope that we can talk about this for just a second, to be able to participate in Passover more than anything else is circumcision. Now, why is circumcision always like all up in the Bible? Like, for real, guys. You're like, we get it. It's kind of an intense thing. Why is it so common? Why is it so dominant? And honestly, for years and years and years, I just thought it was like, oh, some sort of sign that God decided. And last year, I learned for the first time why circumcision is so important. In the ancient Near Eastern world, they believe that whoever has the most life and vitality in them would have the most children. Make sense? So, like, for instance, like, you've probably heard of, like, other nations that it's like, I have 27 children, therefore I'm the most potent male. I'm the most strong. We do this with animals. You have a stud. I used to work on a horse ranch, and it was like, you have a stud, and however many children he can sire, he's the super stud. And so there's this certain sense that if I can have a lot of children, I have tremendous amount of vitality in me. I'm more powerful, more strong than others. This is why in the ancient Near Eastern world, they take other wives so that they can just have more children, to show how powerful the life force is inside of them. So for the ancient Near Eastern world, to circumcise someone, in their mind, the foreskin is the indication of how potent you are. So when you remove the foreskin, their mindset is, there's no way you're going to be able to have nearly as many children as we are. And so God decides to show to all the nations through this crazy picture of circumcision that none of them have power, none of them have life like he has life. And so if you circumcise, you're actually putting your trust in the only one who can bring life instead of trusting you and your ability. Isn't that wild? It's mind-blowing. Never in my last year was the first time I ever I found it out. I was teaching high schoolers and at the school in the building, and I ended up researching it for one of the classes I was teaching. I was like, I've never heard. So it's this whole question of who has the most life. And it's all about Yahweh has the life. Not a human, not a person, not another deity. Only God has life. He is the only one who has that power. And literally, he can stop that power or he can release that power at any time. And that's the beautiful story in Scripture, is that so many times God reverses barrenness. Because they would assumed that the barrenness was that the life was not being able to be carried and had anymore. And God comes in and he reverses it because he is the God of life. So as they're inviting these other people into this, they're inviting them to not just be circumcised. They're inviting them in to trust the life giver. And as they trust the life giver, they become part of the community. And so Israel, when it comes out of Egypt, is not just Israel. It's all of these crazy foreigners as well who are living in Egypt who join them. And we begin to see the expansion and the inclusion of the nations in this Exodus moment, which I think is amazing. Chapter 13, we get into the dedication of the firstborn child. So I think that this is really powerful, really helpful, because we saw the firstborn in Egypt was given over to death because they followed their Pharaoh. They followed thinking he is the ruler and the powerful one. Instead, Israel says, we're going to follow God. We're going to dedicate our son to the God of life. And in doing so, commit our whole family lines to embrace the life. So that happens at the beginning of chapter 13. Another interesting thing that I just remembered from chapter 12. It says, when they came up out of Egypt, that they were wearing so much clothing and gold that it literally says that they stripped Egypt of their wealth. which is like a really interesting phrase. Because again, to be naked and ashamed, right, is like the goal in Genesis, and they end up covering themselves with fig leaves. But then God comes on the scene, and what does he do? He slays an animal and makes something for them. Now, if you went to Sunday school like I did, it was a really cute Tarzan kind of triangle for the men and 3 triangles for the women. But that's not what the word is in the scriptures. It says that God clothed them with a robe, which is the same word as a robe for Joseph. When he wears the brightly colored, it's clothing of honor and esteem and recognition. And they come out of Egypt not just wearing skimpiness, to just cover their issues, so to speak, but they come out with honor as new people. And I think it's beautiful because it's really showing them there's this way out, there's this way God wants you to live. You're being formed into a people with identity and with incredible meaning to your existence. You're not just nobodies. And so as they have the freedom, then everybody else gets the freedom too, all the foreigners around. Because when life happens, it begets more life. And that's the way the ancient Near Eastern world thought. So if these people received freedom, so did everybody else around them. Which is a really beautiful picture for us as we are being formed into the likeness of God. We find ourselves forming others into his likeness as well as an extension of that. So they become a new community, and they basically are recognizing that they don't have to live the way that they lived before. How great that is. I think it's crazy to think about this community because it's not just one kind of people, it's also multi-generational. There's an intergenerational reality to it. There's about 2 million people who are coming out of Egypt. This is not a small number, especially in the ancient Near Eastern world. 2 million people are coming out. The age span is vast because there's that many people. And then they're called basically to keep this festival for all time. And that keeping sense is always about remembering for the sake of the next generation. There's so much generational language throughout the book. Why? Because if you are generating, it means that life is being extended. And so there's a lot of generative language that shows up, which is creational language in the big picture. I think, where do I want to go next? In chapter 13, we get a couple other things happening outside of just the firstborns being dedicated to the Lord. We find that these firstborns in the ancient Near Eastern world get special status, and their special status helps to create initiation rights and inheritance rights. And by having these firstborns kind of dedicated to the Lord, there is a redemption that is there, that God has already brought them into their identity before they ever have to do anything to work it out, which is really encouraging for us because most of us, when we're coming out of slavery, when we're coming out of that violent work that Pharaoh made us live under, when we come out of it, our first thought is, what do we do? Oh, how do we do this? How do we follow God? And he's like, no. I need you to say, I have been redeemed, and that's the point. And then we can figure out how to walk this thing out. And it's not a rush to do right away. In chapter 13, verse 17, we get a very strong word, which is highlighting the nature of this life. And it says that God was leading the people. Not on the main road that runs through the Philistine territory, even though it was the shortest route to the promised land. God basically led them in, I love this, a roundabout way. Now listen, I know we don't like this, but in our formation, the shortest way is not the fastest way to be formed. Ooh. See, we live in a world that's obsessed with efficiency, but God is inefficient because he's so formational. Life is also not always moving towards efficiency. If you study the world and study just creation, it's not always the most efficient thing that wins out. If you were to plant 4 or 5 seeds, efficiency is not always the answer. So many times it's about the vitality of the seed. And so I think for a lot of us, we're having to begin to shift and engage our mindsets on this efficiency approach that we have. That we have to be efficient. We have to make the most of everything. And when we do that, we unintentionally move towards a working slavish mindset, which is the Egyptian picture of how to live. The Egyptian formation is do more work with what? Less. Do you remember? Pharaoh tells them, I want you to make bricks. Now I want you to make bricks without straw. So you're really having to be efficient. You're really having to be a problem solver. You're really having to figure all these things out. And then the Lord's like, actually, you want to take the shortest route? Nah. I want you to take the roundabout way. And I'm going to lead you in a way that you're probably not going to be excited about. And it's interesting that the Lord leads them into the wilderness. Now, I know that most of us are like, the wilderness is the worst thing ever. But I want to tell you something about the wilderness that's like a super secret, if you don't already know this. In Hebrew, midbar or midbar is the Hebrew word. I made it English style. Midbar or a midbar. And it means the place of speaking, acting, or engaging. Now, in the formational reality, why would God take you to a place where he's stripped you away from all of the lavish, wonderful, beautiful world of Egypt that has everything you can ever possibly want in the realm of amenities and take you to a place of speaking and acting and engaging? It's for your formation. It's so that you would learn how to listen and how to respond and how to interact with him. And for so many of us, we feel these moments in our life where God, I feel like you put me in a desert. I feel like you put me into the wilderness. But here's what's crazy. And I learned this because of my kids. The wilderness has one of the most vast ecosystems on the planet. The wilderness is teeming with life. It just looks a whole lot different than a forest or a rainforest. And so some of it is about us learning to be receptive to this new way that God is inviting the people of Israel to lean into, and these, other nations that have joined them. And so I think a lot of times, we want to take the shortest route. But you know what the Lord says about the shortest route? If you take the shortest route, you'll end up in a lot of battles. And if you end up in a lot of battles, your mind will get changed. And if your mind changes, then you will go back to Egypt again and again and again and again. Why? They'd been there for 400 years. It's like what they'd known. But the new path is that God's taking you away from everything so that you could learn to hear and receive in the wilderness. It's this beautiful place where it's teaching you how to receive the life that is right in front of you, and really life that you can't get on your own. It's life that God provides. It's also beautiful that we get at the end of chapter 13, God reveals himself in a really unique way. It is a cloud by day and a fire by night. What does this do in the realm of formation? Any of you ever been in a big, open, empty, deserty place? What is there not a whole lot of? Shade. So why would you need a giant cloud to be leading you? So that there would be shade all the time. Why at night would you need a blazing fire pillar to be guiding you and leading you? Because people forget all the time that the desert in the middle of the night is freezing cold. You need fire to be able to stay alive and to stay warm and to be engaged. And so God is already revealing a little bit more about how he's a creator God, because he's providing them with the things they need just to journey. It's beautiful. I love it. I think it's just, and it's always throughout Scripture, whether it's a cloud or whether it's a fire, it's an indication that God is present with us. And so regardless of if we're going into the wilderness, the encouragement is our formation is that he is with us. Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is such a wild story on a number of levels, especially in the realm of formation. They're in the wilderness. Pharaoh is coming after them because he woke up one day and realized, oh my goodness, I don't have my slaves anymore. I can't have the kingdom that I have without people who are going to be working for me for free. Wakes up to his senses. He's like, you know what? I'm going to go get them all. But his decreator energy is so strong that he's not going to just go get them and bring them back. You know what it says? It says that he says, I'm going to go get them and kill them all. I'm going to slaughter 2 million people because I am so mad and I think so highly of myself that I think I can take control over everyone else who doesn't do what I want them to do. Whoa, like this is like level 3000 of intensity and how much he exerts himself as basically a God who can control other people's lives. And so throughout the chapter, what we begin to see is that God's creation and his redemption are fusing together because God is the God of creation and he is the God who creates, but he's also the God who redeems or rescues or saves or delivers, whatever you want to. But this is a hinge point for them to see, yes, he saved them from Egypt, but this moment is like the defining moment where we see that redemption and creation aspect merged and fused together. Why? Because they butt up against a sea. A Red Sea, some people say it's a reed sea. I don't care. The point is there's a lot of water that's preventing them from walking through it. And in the story, as you read through it, the question is what are we going to do? And of course, the Israelite people are always like, it would be better to be slaves than to be dead. Now hear that though. The logic of that is not sound because slavery leads to death because you're serving the decreating death god of Pharaoh. And so they've so missed it already that this is the God of life and he's trying to invite them into following life in all ways. And it's really beautiful because Moses starts off in verse 13 of chapter 14. He says to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still. Watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see will never again be seen. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just calm. Just stay calm. Now, I love this so much. There's so many things here. There's so many just powerful pictures that I think are happening. In the ancient Near Eastern world, anytime you see water, it is most often, it's a symbol of life, where you drink it and it brings you life, or it's a symbol of chaos and death and the grave. Great examples like Jesus, he cast the demons into a bunch of pigs, and then the pigs go into the water. Why? Because that's considered like death, the grave, and like hell is at the bottom of like the water in their mind. This is like their ancient Near Eastern mind. So Jesus is just sending those demons right back to their home. But it's the picture of chaos. And we get this with the flood, right? The flood comes and it's chaotic and it ruins everything on the earth. But what God preserves life in the ark. We talked about how Moses is in an ark in a basket as he floats down. So there's all these pictures of God's hovering sensibility of life over the death of chaos. And he can rule it, and he can reign it, and he can speak to it, and he can make it, and he can form it. And that's the beautiful picture that's showing up again, where he's like, hey, watch what I can do in the middle of chaos. Watch what I can do in the middle of the difficulty. Watch what I can do when Egypt would form you to be going towards death and chaos, and instead, by chasing you down, I'm going to show you something different. And so in this story, Moses invites them, hey, stand still. And it says that the Lord tells him to raise his hand over the sea because he's going to divide the water. There's going to be dry ground. The dry ground is going to happen because of a strong wind. There's going to be walls of water that are going to be erected, and you're going to be able to get in through the other side. So many things happening here. Number one, just the even idea of him raising his hand with the staff over the sea is the same kind of picture of God's power, which has been representation in Moses' staff, over the chaos. And once that happens, then the water's divided. Does that sound like Genesis 1? Yes. literally the Lord divides the land from the water, and so he's just doing a creational thing all over again. Not only is it just ground that's muddy, it's dry ground. Why? Because it says a wind actually blew all night long. Anytime we get a wind like this, we're reminded of what? Creation, where God breathes life into humanity. Into what? Dirt, right? Remember this? This is how humans are created in the scriptures. God breathes his spirit into humans and their clay or in their dirt and their dust, and they become living creatures. And so in this moment, God is showing them, like, I'm making you living creatures as you go through this all over again. You are being recreated as you pass through these waters, and these waters become like walls, and I literally have control and order over all the chaos so that you will be safe. It's a beautiful picture. It's also really awesome because it's super baptismal. You're like, what? Baptismal? When you're going into the baptism, the traditions of the church is that you go into the water and you go down into your death, and you leave all of the death behind you, and you come up out of the water and you are raised in newness of life. And so the whole 2 million people are getting baptized. What are they being baptized into? Into a new way to live with God. To be able to serve him and worship him and acknowledge the one who creates life instead of being enslaved to the God who only brings death. It's so cool. It's so powerful. And we just don't always see it because we're just not familiar with some of these pictures. And now you're going to start reading the scriptures and you're like, oh, now I get why the Lord is the king over the flood. Why? Because he's the God who's reigning over chaos with all of the life that's inside of him. There's also this really interesting aspect that's happening in the creational way, is that you get Moses, who is the human agent of God's creation, that's ruling over natural elements of God's creation, the water. And then as Moses rules over the natural elements of water, God joins him in affirmation of his agency and does the work with him to be able to create almost like a trinity, like a harmony of their work and their activity. So creation and God and humans work together to create this situation. Now, I don't know about you, but that to me speaks a lot about our everyday lives. That you can come into this situation with God and with creation, all of the universe, and you can work together to create spaces that's allowing people to come into identity, come into life, and come out of slavery. It could happen in lots of ways. In this one, it's a deliverance in some regard. It's really fascinating because so many times with all of the plagues that happen, there's this sense of, oh no, we're going to be ruined by something that's in nature, that's outside of our control, boils or whatever. But we end up hearing later in the story that it is the God who heals. And so there's healing kind of at the end of this journey through the Red Sea that we'll hear a little bit more about in a second. The other thing that's interesting is God's strategy is really fascinating because Pharaoh's heart keeps getting hard. He hardens it, then God gives it over to be even more hard by inciting that hyper reality upon the Pharaoh. And it's interesting because the word heavy is the word kaved. Now, there's a wordplay here because in chapter 14, the Lord's like, hey, I'm going to do this thing so that you will see my glory, which is the word kavod. So you get the hardening of Pharaoh, kaved, to the kavod, the glory of God. So God is going to reveal his weightiness, his power, his might, and show how that hard heart, that stubborn heart actually doesn't bring anything but death, which is such a huge challenge for us. And so I think for all of us, we get to ask ourselves, what do we do in these moments? How do we live? How do we function? How do we engage? And I love the explanation that Moses says to them. First he's like, hey, just stand still. Just stand still. And so I think that the first thing, in some ways of our formation and what we're in, is that we would recognize that God is doing something right here and right now. He's done something in the past for us. He passed over us. We know he's going to do something because he's opened this Red Sea. But am I paying attention to who he is right now? And that's such a formative piece for us. The second part is that he's like, hey, watch the Lord rescue you. If you're not looking for salvation, you're missing it every day. You are being gifted with life constantly. The air in your lungs, the fact that all of your organs work without you telling them to work, the fact that your brain is processing the universe and you haven't told your brain, please process the universe. All of your senses are opening to everything that's there. That is because God is ordering and bringing life into you all the time. Can you watch it? Can you see it? Can you notice it? It's happening right here and right now. And then he says, the Lord will fight for you. And just stay calm. And I think that for us, when we're calming ourselves, when we're stilling ourselves, I really thought this was interesting, is that it's not that we become passive people. It's just that we learn how to be silent. Now, why is that so important? Because up until this point, it was the cry of God's people that initiated his involvement. They cry from their slavery. They cry from dying. The babies are crying as they're being killed. And instead, God's like, hey, I can do that, but I can also do just as much when you are silent. And so there's a formation that's happening in the realm of silence, just like in creation, that until God speaks, nothing happens. So we just need to be quiet enough so that God can say, let there be light, and there is, and let the waters go here, and it does. And it's the listening space, because we're in the wilderness. We're in Midbar. We're in the place of hearing, the place of speaking. We're in that space to realize who God is and all the life that he's trying to offer us. It's available. The last kind of piece in that is that the Lord will save us or rescue us. I think this is so encouraging, and I think you'll love it. In Hebrew, it says, watch the Lord Yeshua you today. Yeshua is the Hebrew name for Jesus. So it's like, hey, watch the Lord Yeshua you today, rescue you, save you. And I think there's something really beautiful about that, because, we know the end of the story and it's so much more beautiful. But in some ways, there's this implantation into their hearts, into their minds, that they are being rescued by God in a real person, not just like in a big overarching power, but in a real human who's coming to bring rescue and safety. And this is how God wants to be seen and known and engaged in. And this is both individual for each of these people and corporate and universal, because there's the invitation to the rest of the nations that are around. This Yeshua word, rescue, save, it almost always has the implications of socio-political spaces. So the rescuing and the saving is to save you from the society that you're in. It's to rescue from the political space that you're under. That you don't have to be oppressed by that. You can actually live separate from that. You don't have to be formed by that. You can be formed by God in a life way and still live in it or be freed from it. And I think that that's such an invitation for us, especially in the region that we live in, because there's always a battle that's raging in the socio-political spaces or sociopolitics of this area. It's interesting that God gets introduced here in a way that we haven't quite seen him, which is that he is a bit of a warrior. Throughout the Old Testament, God is not a warrior, often only a few times. The picture is that he is the one who does the work. You don't have to do it on your own. Notice, I didn't say you don't have to do it. You just don't have to do it on your own. He wants to do it with you. And there's that joining reality. And that joint reality is literally a restoration of Genesis chapter 1, where God says, male and female, I've created them to rule and have dominion over the earth. It's that they would work with God on this thing. And that's who God made them to be, is to work with him, to tend the garden, to keep it. God's tending and keeping too. He's not just removing himself, he's engaging in it. And this is one of the biggest lies that we've believed, is that God just sits upon the throne and doesn't involve himself in anything. And there's nothing further from the truth. He wants to lean in and step into all of the things. When this happens, crazy. It says that they all go through. The Egyptians come in after. It literally says that the Lord comes in and he causes for all of their wheels to fall off their chariots, which, by the way, in the scriptures, you've probably acknowledged this or heard people say this. There's a verse that says, some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will remember or trust in the name of the Lord our God. Anybody familiar with that verse or heard it in church ever? It's in the Psalms. We used to sing it in my church. And the reason why is that chariots and horses are always the sign that a nation has extreme power. If you have horses, you're super powerful. If you have chariots, you're the most powerful people on the planet. And Egypt was notoriously known for having chariots. And so it's funny that the Lord comes in and he literally stifles their power by removing their wheels, which is just like such a wild thing that I think a lot of people don't even read this and remember it. But that's exactly what he does, is he throws their forces into total confusion. He rips off their chariot wheels and making them unable to drive. And they're all like, hey, let's get out of here from these Israelites. And this is so fascinating. Egypt is the first to initiate the last stage of what we're talking about today. They say this. This is in verse 25. The Lord is fighting them. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. When God begins to work and we're working with him in a non-slavish way, all of the nations will acknowledge what is happening. This is all throughout the Old Testament, that the nations see and acknowledge and hear when God begins to live fully amongst his people and life is being engaged and portrayed throughout the earth. What we end up finding is that so much life happens that the nations say, this God is different. He's not the same. He's not one that leads in death. He leads in this crazy life, and his life is so powerful that it disrupts everything. And so they're the first ones to praise, which is really interesting. They're the first ones to acknowledge what is happening. As they come through the Red Sea, they're basically, this creative order is reestablished, and this praise that comes up out of them, this praise that comes up and engages from within them, it is the response of what God is doing in bringing all of this life to everybody. So it says not one of them survived. Like, none of the Egyptians made it through. And I love it at the end of chapter 14. It says, when the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. And they put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Because they recognized, they put their faith, they literally said, hey, in order for us to move forward, we have to have fear, awe, reverence, following the Lord wherever he goes with no fear, and then we have to have faith. And this brings us to chapter 15, which initiates an incredible psalm of Moses and of the people. And verses 1 to 18, it's crazy. It's awesome. It's basically all about what the Lord is doing, what he's all about, how he's revealing himself. I will sing unto the Lord, for he's triumphed gloriously. He has hurled the horse and the rider into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He's given me victory. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and the armies hurled into the sea. The finest of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters gushed over them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. And it goes on and on and on. And it goes, verse 11, it's a very famous verse. Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? Glorious in holiness, awesome in splendor, performing great wonders. You raise your right hand, and the earth swallowed our enemies. With your unfailing love, you led the people you have redeemed. In your might, you guide them to your sacred home. I love 13 because I think it really gives us the picture that the God who is the God of life is leading us, and I love this, with unfailing love. He's not leading us with force. He's not leading us with pushing. He's not leading us with tyranny. He's not leading us with expectations that you should be doing more. He's leading you with unfailing love. And all of a sudden you start to ask the question, am I being led by the Lord? Well, the question is do you feel the life and the love that's there in it? Because if you're not feeling the life and you're not feeling the Lord, it's very possible that you're being led by an Egyptian mindset. Now remember, we're not talking about the actual nation of Egypt that exists in the world today. Biblically, we're talking about the idea and concept of Egypt, which is all tied in with the deities of power and trying to rise to the tops of the universe instead of acknowledging that God is the only way to do that. that in this moment we get praise introduced to us in these two hymns, one of Moses, the second of Miriam in verse 21. In the tradition of the scriptures, most people think that Miriam sang the song first. So in 21, this is a song she sings. Sing to the Lord, for he's triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both the horse and the rider into the sea. And then they basically think that Moses and everybody else took her little ditty and made it bigger. It's kind of like one person starts singing the song and then everybody blows the song up. All of the tradition says that they believe that Miriam was probably the first one who sang that song. And it's really beautiful because, again, it goes back to the aspect that when they come into the new creation, when they come up out of the chaos and they're coming through on dry land and there are new people and there's a new established identity, that there is a woman who is reestablished first. This is so powerful because if we go back to Genesis, we know that there is a woman in the scene who is deceived by the serpent. And so there's a reclaiming, a redeeming of her divine identity to lead and to declare the words of the Lord and to declare in song who he is. And we know later that Miriam becomes a major leadership person in the story of Exodus, and we'll read more about that. She becomes a prophetess. She becomes one who brings the song of the Lord. She's one who is able to bring wisdom and insight into the things of God. She also has some sibling rivalry, which, we all have a little bit of that. But ultimately, we see that Miriam is depicting this leadership. And you know what's powerful is it says that as she's leading, all of the women are singing and dancing. That there is a release of life because dancing is twirling and spinning. And I would go so far to say skipping. Back to skipping. That as you come into a baptismal moment where you begin to follow life and you begin to live in life, you start demonstrating what the God that you serve looks like. And the God that we serve looks like walking past people who should be dying and granting them life. And he skips over those who deserve death to bring life. And in our praise, in our worship of the living God, we begin to enact the same thing that's happening in Passover in our praise. Now, I'm not saying that all of you need to go skipping around the church and twirling and spinning. If you want to, this is probably the place that would accept that. But if you acknowledge that your worship and your praise is enacting the very realities of Passover and you're beginning to give life and redemption as you worship the living God, you will praise different. You will praise different when you realize what God has brought you up out of. You will praise different when you realize that your praise is enacting an identity formation in you. That if you're struggling in your life, try praising. Try acknowledging where the life came from. Like praise is the denotation of your identity. Whatever you praise is what your identity is. Oh man, that movie was so amazing. Whatever that movie's about is your identity. Oh hey, you know what I really love? Tell me what you really love. I love the Philadelphia Eagles. Whoa, is that your identity? That's not Uncle Bill, guys. That's not Uncle Bill. But it's funny because you will praise whatever you identify with. Now, this is the issue with our earth right now, is that we're all praising the wrong thing. We're to be praising the author of life. We're to be praising the one who gives us breath. And when we do that, we will be defined as one who gives life and breath wherever we go. If we try to praise ourselves or praise something about us, we will be led back into slavery. Because we are just like Pharaoh, who unintentionally take the power and think that we can do everything. We can fix everything. We can efficiency it up. We can change the whole world by how hard we work and how much we can provide for ourselves and how much we can save up in our barns. And the Lord would say to us today, but is there life there? No. And so our praise begins to just mirror where our hearts are at and invites us into a new way, invites us into the new path that God is saying, hey, I would love to show you this. I would love to reveal this to you. Are you game? Are you willing? Are you interested? And so these people become defined by this. It reveals God's character at its highest form, and praise is ultimately a huge part of your formation because it is multi-directional. It's not, your praise doesn't just affect you, it affects everybody around you, and it highlights the God who is with you. It also highlights the leadership that God puts in your life, the Moseses that show up. Our praise amplifies who God is and reveals the attractiveness of who he is to the whole world and to the nations. Praise is no cheap thing. Praise is a witness to the world. And so if we praise, everything can be seen for what it really is. The Creator God, we praise the Creator God who sets the chaos and the oppression straight. He actually makes it so that justice is possible. And I'll be honest, I think the world is looking for justice all day, every day. And we can say, oh, we know who can bring justice. And watch my life because I'm going to be like him and then I can bring justice in every space that I'm in. As they become these new created imagers through the sea, they're recreated by this new way. They're able to truly be those who praise. Which, if you remember, Moses' whole asking of Pharaoh is, will you let these people go so that they can worship Yahweh at his mountain? Or, I think we talked about this last week, the word worship is also serve. So they move from slavery to service. But it's not working out of my energies and my pressures and that oppression. It's me working and serving and acknowledging by saying, hey, God, what kind of life are you bringing? I want to do it with you. I want to be an agent with you. Verse 22, we get a little pivot. They've been praising. It's great. It's wonderful. And they move into the desert even further. They traveled into this desert for 3 days without finding any water. And when they came to the oasis of Mara, the water was too bitter to drink, so they called the place Mara, which means bitter. And the people complained and turned against Moses. What are we going to drink? Moses cries out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it in the water, and this made the water good to drink. It was there at Marah that the Lord set before them the following decree as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. He said, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, notice, listen carefully. Why? Because you're in the place of listening, the place of words. You're in the desert. And you do what is right in the sight. That's the acting part. And keeping all his decrees, the engaging part, right? See, I'm not leading you astray. These things are right here. Then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases that I set on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. And so this reality of the wilderness becomes the place of your greatest healing. Now, I know that sounds crazy. Wait, wilderness, desert seasons are what's going to bring me healing? Yes. Why? Because you will not be able to look to any other thing to bring you healing in life. You will only have one option. What an invitation. I love this. I used to joke with people, I'm like, I feel like I've lived in the wilderness so long, you just might as well call me a wilder king. I kid you not. My whole life, it doesn't matter how much I try. I'm like, I'm going to promise next season. It's like the Lord's like, you're back in wilderness, Jason. And I realized something though. And this is like a cheater. Like, I'll tell you the secrets ahead. But there's a couple people who learn to live in the wilderness really well, that they get to promise and they see the promise, and guess what they do? They go back into wilderness. Why? For the next generation. So maybe if you feel like you keep going in the wilderness again and again, it's not actually about you. It's about the next generation. So be encouraged. That's like Caleb and Joshua energy, by the way. That they're able to recognize that I can live in the wilderness to hopefully bring another generation into the spaces that God wants to bring them into. And I'm confident for the rest of my life, if I'm wandering the wilderness, I'm happy because it's the place where he's speaking and I get to act and engage and respond to him. And even if the promised land is the day that I die and I'm with him forever, that's worth it. It's worth it because there's life to be had in the wilderness. There's hope to be had in the wilderness. There is a praise to happen in the wilderness because God is there. And that's what he's trying to get through to them on. They then, in 16, first they're complaining about no water. Then they're complaining about no food. And so then God gives them multiple kinds of food. But let me just tell you some crazy little things that are happening here. I love that he makes this allusion to, hey, I'm the God who heals you. I'm not the one who plagues you. The first plague is about water because the water's undrinkable. The water in the Nile turns to what? Blood. They cannot drink it. So the life source for all of these people, the Nile River, they couldn't drink it. So it was death to them. In the same reality, there's this beautiful picture being played to say, hey, this is how it happens in Egypt. But in this situation, instead of the water being drinkable and turning to undrinkable, it's going to be undrinkable and turn to drinkable. I'm going to heal the water. Before, I showed Egypt I can make the water unhealed. But here, I'm going to make it healed for you. Same thing with food. There's really weird words in here. So it says in the plagues that it rained hail. Well, here, it rains quail. There's all these funny plays, or it's like when they went out, it says in the plagues that the ground was covered with locust, and here the ground is covered with manna. And so there's this beautiful picture again, and I'm trying to say that like this is all about relationship because it's recognizing that there is a relationship with God that you can have that brings all of this life and this provision in this whole system, or there is another system of relating that is oppressive and violent and controlling and efficient and power hungry and building and expanding, and this does not bring life. What relationship do you want to live in? Your call. God's not forcing people. He's like, if you want to, you just have to cut off your impotency, circumcision. And you cut off your own ability, and what you do is you trust mine. This is the whole form. You see why Exodus is so formational for us. Because it's calling us into the recognition that we cannot save ourselves. And we really suck at that, guys. We think we can save ourselves and the world, and we cannot. The wilderness becomes this countercultural place where the expectation of promise feels delayed and yet realized. It goes on to talk all about the manna. It talks about the honey wafers. It talks about Sabbath, which I talked about a few weeks ago, so I'm not going to go into the whole. This is the first time Sabbath shows up in the scriptures outside of Genesis chapter 7. But where would the Lord want to bring Sabbath into the place of what? Wilderness. Why? Because he wants to show that whether you're in Eden, in a garden, or if you're in the wilderness, it is the same. He's still the same creator. You still don't have to do the same kind of work. You can live with life and with love instead of oppression and fear. I just loved it. I was just so encouraged that in all of this, God basically just starts saying, hey, we can do this. Next time we come together, we'll hit 17, where we get to hear about water from the rock. I'll just tell you about this real quick because I feel like this is a good place to end. We'll go to 17. They ask again, are you trying to kill us? No, we have no thirst. It's water again. And in this moment, a couple of things happen. The Lord says to Moses, walk out in front of the people, take your staff, and strike. The way that you struck the water of the Nile, I want you to strike the rock. And when you strike the rock, the water will come through. And so basically, it's this beautiful picture that the Lord is able to provide water from rock just as much as he can create dry land from water. It's this beautiful picture that whatever you think can happen only in one way, God's like, let me show you it can happen in another way. And the wilderness is him revealing all of the other ways that you don't know how he can do it. And so this recreation happens, and I love it. I think it's really beautiful. And Moses ends up calling it Massa, which means testing, and Meribah, which means arguing, because the people argue with Moses and tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord here with us or not?" And I think that is the question for us: is the Lord here with you or not? Wherever you are, if you're in the desert, if you're in the wilderness, if you're in, listen, you might be on the faces of chaos. Is the Lord here or not? And the formational question, the formational is like, hey, listen, you might just need to formatively praise until you understand the liturgy of the Passover, which is that you cannot save yourself. You cannot redeem yourself. You cannot rescue yourself. It is only God who rescues and saves. And there is no king, no leader, no Pharaoh who can do it, only him. And so the formation for us is to find the places of Passover in our existence, to find the places of praise. And when we do, we will find that there is more life in the wilderness, there's more life in the desert than we ever thought possible. And when we live that way, all of the nations will wonder and will say, we witness that there's a God who is not stuck in one space, in one environment. There is nothing that can keep him from bringing life, and there's nothing that can keep him from leading us out with love. Yeah. Come next week, we'll hit 18, and we're going to talk about Mount Sinai and the law. That'll be a lot of fun. 10 Commandments. We're going to unpack that a little bit. And hopefully you can see more of this crazy world of what relational reality are you living in? Are you living in the creational one or the decreational one? And I hope that you'll come back as we journey through it. Love you guys. Hope you have an amazing night.